to my channel. In today's video I wanted to review a book that I read recently, which is actually quite topical in the context of COVID-19 because it's actually a book about the great influenza pandemic of 1918, and it's called Pale Rider by Laura Spinney. The book was actually first published in 2017, so obviously before the pandemic. I read it recently. It's a book I'd received quite a lot of hype, quite a lot of press. I'd be quite interested actually to read Pandemic 1918. Can't remember actually who wrote it, but it's another book anyway about the pandemic, because when I was looking at that and trying to decide what one to get, people gave Pale Rider more favourable reviews, but obviously as I haven't read Pandemic 1918 yet, I can't say what one I prefer, but I would quite like to read it anyway just to get a different perspective. I'll say the book was okay. It wasn't quite as good as maybe I was expecting. I learned a few things, but I thought at times it was maybe a little bit waffly, and also at times it didn't really deal so much. It kind of often went off on tangents and provided some kind of interesting backstories, I guess, about the countries where the pandemic hit. Obviously, the pandemic hit every country in the world practically, apart from the Arctic and Antarctic. I kind of felt at times it maybe was a little bit waffly and didn't provide quite enough detail about the actual disease itself, which is kind of why I was reading it. Really, I wanted to know more about disease. But that said, it was still quite an interesting read. So I like to just go through some of the notes I made on the book. So she starts off really by providing a sort of background to the origins of flu, a kind of evolutionary history, if you like, of flu. And talking about how the survival of flu depends on the behaviour of the host, because obviously flu is a virus and viruses are parasites. The virus depends very much on the behaviour of the host, be it a human or an animal or another living thing. Even bacteria can host viruses, for its survival, as much as so it's a dynamic relationship really between the parasite and the host. Now, 12,000 years ago, humans moved closer together and invented livestock. Some random person, we don't know the names, lost in the winds of history, but some person, probably not on their own. People never invent things on their own, there's always people ride on the shoulders of each other. But maybe someone in that time, just happened to, think, oh, that'd be a good idea to create livestock. Now, some diseases, such as leprosy and malaria, are adapted to the hunter lifestyle. These diseases, such as leprosy and malaria being the classic examples, had animal reservoirs, so they didn't just infect humans, they also infect animals. Animals can also harbour them, and they don't provide lifelong immunity, and this enables the disease to stay alive, it enables it to stay alive. Diseases such as leprosy and malaria are very, 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 very ancient, because they predate the farming revolution, and they were around during our hunter-gatherer days. But for crowd diseases, what have come to be named the crowd diseases, a clue is in a name. These diseases arose when humans began to form settled communities and obviously then were in closer contact with one another, hence the name crowd diseases. These are often exclusive to humans, so they don't tend to have an animal reservoir. So, for example, a classic example of a crowd disease, thankfully now extinct, was smallpox. The great scourge of humanity. I'm rather morbidly interested in smallpox. There is indeed another book I like to read about smallpox at some point because I just find it fascinating. We have to be so thankful that disease is no longer around. But yeah, one of the classic examples of a crowd disease is smallpox. It doesn't have, or didn't have, it's extinct now, but it didn't have an animal reservoir. Obviously, it did originally come from animals, but once it had become a human disease, it then, in a sense, humanised 100%, and that disease became unique to humans. So animals have their own sort of variations of the actual variola virus itself was a human disease. Now, a reservoir animal does not get sick from a virus. So, for example, ducks can be heavily infected with flu without showing signs. So this is how flu is different to, say, smallpox, is that although both flu and smallpox are crowd diseases, that is to say, they came into being during that major shift in human history when we started living closer together in settled communities, what differentiates them is that flu has an animal reservoir whereas smallpox did not. That actually enabled us to get rid of smallpox because there was no animal reservoir. It was a lot easier to vaccinate it into extinction. It becomes a lot harder with a disease that has an animal reservoir because, of course, you might deal with its human form, but then, of course, if it's still existing in the animal reservoir, then you're not going to be able to eliminate it if it's still in the animal reservoir. So yeah, crafty little buggers are ducks. But yes, they do harbour the flu virus, but without getting sick themselves. Now, pigs are potential intermediaries in the process by which the bird disease becomes human, and that's because their cells share features of a bird and human. Bit creepy, that. Another interesting fact, by the way, is that because crowd diseases were introduced by the white man, if you like, into indigenous populations, in actual fact, practically wiping out whole communities, whole indigenous communities. They also came to be known by the title imperial diseases. Smallpox is a classic example of that, when it was brought over to the Americas during the Age of Discovery. Yeah, it practically eliminated the native population in some parts. As it says here, wiped out indigenous populations. For example, Native Americans, a lot of them were, died because they didn't have immunity. None of them had immunity. Same with measles, another crowd disease. Now, interestingly, the name influenza, which is obviously flu, its full name, hasn't got anything to do with birds, the name, as some might suppose. It actually was coined by some 14th century Italians who attributed it to the pull or the influence of stars. Now, in the 19th century, there were two flu pandemics. The first one was in 1830, which was severe, and the second one was known as the Russian flu of 1889. Now, the 1918 flu had three waves. The first wave was mild, the second wave was very severe, and the third one, which occurred sort of around early 1919, and in some parts went on until 1920, was milder than the first. The third one was sort of somewhere in between, so not as severe as the second wave, not as mild as the first. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to move on to video number 2 now to carrying on reviewing this book. So moving on to video number 2.